May 2013. Edward Snowden, an employee of the National Security Agency in Hawaii, makes electronic copies of a vast store of computer files, believing they show that the NSA has been carrying out widespread illegal surveillance of millions of Americans, and flies to Hong Kong with the copies. He contacts reporters from the Guardian newspaper and offers to share the files with them. He stipulates that the reporters, not he, will decide which files to make public. Snowden's revelations lead to a congressional hearing on the goals and operation of the NSA's telephone monitoring program. When pressed for the best example of valuable information gained by the program, the NSA cites the case of a San Diego cab driver who sent $8,500 to Somalia in support of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. In August, Snowden's reports that the government was capturing data about Americans without warrants was confirmed by Senator Wyden. In the same month, the yearly cost for the NSA's activities was projected to be about $53 billion. The following month, it was revealed that the NSA had, in the past, monitored communications of civil rights activists, United States senators, and newspaper reporters without a warrant. In October, it was reported that the NSA listened to 35 world leaders' phone calls, hacked into the connections between data centers owned by Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, and is alleged to have monitored electronic communications of the Vatican. In December, one court ruled that the NSA secret surveillance was unconstitutional, while another ruled that it was not. In the same month, a panel of advisors to the president urged him to undertake greater oversight of the NSA's surveillance activities. Around the time this program was being completed, it was announced that the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, one of the highest awards given to journalists, would be given to the Washington Post and the United States Guardian for their articles on Snowden and the NSA. Hear ye, hear ye. The court is now in session for the trial of the people versus Edward Snowden, an employee of the National Security Agency, or the NSA. There is no doubt that Snowden is guilty of the charges brought against him by the FBI in May 2013 in federal court in Virginia, namely the theft of government properties, unauthorized communications of national defense information, and the willful communication of classified intelligence information to an unauthorized person. Mr. Snowden has said that he decided to violate the law in order to expose the broad surveillance of United States citizens that he believed to be immoral, probably illegal, specifically unconstitutional. However, in addition to revealing these possibly illegal surveillance, Snowden's revelations about the NSA programs may have put U.S. troops at risk and prompted terrorists to change their tactics. You, the jury, will be asked to determine whether his actions were justified and whether he could have raised the questions he's raised without impairing the function of an important United States intelligence agency. I hereby call to the stand Edward Snowden. Mr. Snowden, would you describe your recent employment history in the intelligence community?
I've been a systems engineer, systems administrator, senior advisor for the Central Intelligence Agency, solutions consultant, and a telecommunications information systems officer.
Is there anything you learned during the course of your work with the NSA that led you to take the actions you took?
When you're in positions of privileged access, like a systems administrator for these sort of intelligence community agencies, you're exposed to a lot more information on a broader scale than the average employee. And because of that, you see things that may be disturbing, but over the course of a normal person's career, you'd only see one or two of these instances. When you see everything, you see them on a more frequent basis. And you recognize that some of these things are actually abuses. And when you talk to people about them, in a place like this where this is the normal state of business, people tend not to take them very seriously and move on from them. But over time, that awareness of wrongdoing sort of builds up, and you feel compelled to talk about it. And the more you talk about it, the more you're ignored, the more you're told it's not a problem. until eventually you realize that these things need to be determined by the public, not by somebody who was simply hired by the government.
What exactly did you reveal, and why did you reveal it?
NSA and the intelligence community in general is focused on getting intelligence wherever it can, by any means possible, that it believes on the grounds of sort of a self-certification that they serve the national interest. Originally, we saw that focus very narrowly tailored as foreign intelligence gathered overseas. Now, increasingly, we see that it's happening domestically. And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends. So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so.
Are there any limits to whose communications can be monitored? Are there any warrants required? Does the system respect any legal standards or boundaries?
Any analyst at any time can target anyone, any selector anywhere. Where those communications will be picked up depends on the range of the sensor networks and the authorities that that analyst is empowered with. Not all analysts have the ability to target everything, but I, sitting at my desk, certainly have the authorities to wiretap anyone, from you or your accountant to a federal judge to even the president if I had a personal email.
Mr. Snowden, why should ordinary Americans be concerned about what the NSA is doing?
Because even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're being watched and recorded. And the storage capability of these systems increases every year consistently by orders of magnitude, to where it's getting to the point you don't have to have done anything wrong. You simply have to eventually fall under suspicion from somebody, even by a wrong call. And then they can use the system to go back in time and scrutinize every decision you've ever made, every friend you've ever discussed something with, and attack you on that basis to sort of derive suspicion from an innocent life and paint anyone in the context of a wrongdoer.
Having made these revelations, what is your greatest fear now?
The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change. People will see in the media all of these disclosures. They'll know the lengths that the government is going to grant themselves powers unilaterally to create greater control over American society and global society. But they won't be willing to take the risks necessary to stand up and fight to change things, to force their representatives to actually take a stand in their interests.
I now call the prosecution's first witness, Attorney Robert Rosenkranz. Attorney Rosenkranz is a graduate of Yale University and the Harvard Law School. He's the founder of Intelligence Squared, a televised debate program that focuses on important topics of the day. Most of the video that appears in this program has been excerpted from a debate sponsored by Intelligence Squared. Mr. Rosenkranz, do you believe that Edward Snowden was merely a whistleblower?
He was far more than a whistleblower. He tried to subvert, or at least did subvert, the very mission of the NSA. I mean, their job is to keep track of our enemies, to see what's going on in Iran and in Russia, and with Al-Qaeda and so on, or with our adversaries like China. And he undermined their ability to do that job in a very serious way. He revealed which codes they had broken. He revealed what methods they use. He revealed what firewalls had been breached. He revealed which computers had been hacked into, which individuals had been targeted. I mean, this was a serious setback for national security. And he didn't just do this. I mean, this was a very deliberate thing. He took the job with the intention of stealing secrets and disseminating them, held the job for 3 months, and when he did what he set out to do, he flees to China and then Russia takes with him 4 laptops full of secret information, which you have to presume that both the Chinese and the Russians now have. I mean, this is espionage of the most serious sort. It would be that he should be punished to the full extent of the law.
I now call the defense's first witness, Ben Weisner. Mr. Weisner is director of the American Civil Liberties Union Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. He is also a legal advisor to Edward Snowden and is regularly involved in discussions with him over encrypted channels. Mr. Weisner, why do you feel Mr. Snowden was justified in revealing NSA's activities?
Edward Snowden is justified because he provided to journalists, and through them to us, information that we had a right to know and that we had a need to know. The government had not just concealed this information, it had lied to us about it. And the debate that we've had and that we're still having would not have happened any other way. President Obama also defended the government's surveillance practices. He said that those practices had been blessed and approved by all 3 branches of government, within the executive branch, by the courts, and by the Congress. Now, in making that point, President Obama probably would have said that he was joining our opponent's table. I would respectfully submit that exactly the opposite is true. And why do I say that? The same oversight bodies that had blessed these activities in the dark have dramatically challenged them and changed course in the light. Now all 3 branches of government are engaged in a historic reevaluation of the NSA's surveillance practices, and we're virtually certain to see the first new limits on intelligence surveillance since the 1970s. What a difference an informed public can make. In short, our traditional democratic oversight mechanisms failed miserably before Snowden's revelations. Now they're doing their jobs. Let's begin with Congress. When The Guardian revealed that the NSA had been collecting the phone records of every American on a daily basis, many members of Congress expressed shock, even though that program was purportedly authorized by Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Now, there's been a lot of debate since then about whether Congress did or did not know, or what they knew or did not know. But does it really matter? Either way, this was a colossal failure of oversight. Either they knew and did nothing, or they didn't know what the NSA was doing in collecting all of Americans' information on a daily basis. Now, we're all familiar with Congress's most dramatic oversight failure. And this was in the notorious exchange between Senator Ron Wyden and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. Wyden asked, does the NSA collect any type of data on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? Clapper's answer was, no, sir. Now, this brazen falsehood is most often described as Clapper's lie to Congress, but that's not what it was. Wyden knew that Clapper was lying. Only we didn't know. And Congress lacked the courage to correct the record, allowed us to be deceived by the Director of National Intelligence. To me, that is the very definition of failed oversight. And Edward Snowden was watching. Now, what about our courts? The court that had blessed the NSA's mass surveillance of Americans is a specialized court that meets in secret and hears only from the government. It was designed to grant warrants for foreign intelligence collection. It makes sense that such a court would hear only for the government. Over the last decade, it expanded its role to rule on the legality and constitutionality of programmatic surveillance. Judicial review of those programs amounted to a secret court upholding secret programs by secretly reinterpreting American federal laws. Now, when groups like the ACLU tried to challenge the NSA's activities in open federal courts, an interesting thing happened. The government didn't say to those courts that the programs were illegal. The government said that we had no right to be in court. And the courts acceded to that demand. The government's argument was we couldn't prove that we had been surveilled, therefore we had no standing to even raise these challenges. A newly energized Congress has held dozens of oversight hearings, public ones, and is considering sweeping intelligence reforms that we haven't seen in nearly half a century to end bulk collection of Americans' phone records, to reform that secret FISA court so that it doesn't only hear from the government and others. Even the executive branch has undergone an extraordinary reevaluation of these programs. An NSA review panel appointed by the president, which included very, very senior former intelligence officials, the number 2 at the CIA, concluded that the NSA had allowed its technological capabilities to dictate its surveillance practices rather than ensuring that its practices conform to our laws and values. None of this would have happened without Edward Snowden. For that reason alone, he was justified.
Thank you, Mr. Wisner. I will now call on prosecution witness James Woolsey. Mr. Woolsey was the director of the CIA between 1993 and 1995. He currently serves as the chair of the Foundation on Defense and Democracy. Mr. Woolsey, what do you believe is wrong with what Mr. Snowden did?
Once you release material that had been classified or restricted for any other contractual or any other reason, you release it to the world. Mr. Snowden pledged to protect the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, but he didn't do that. What he did was steal and release material that went to, among others, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Pyongyang, Tehran, and so on. In the real world, you can't have a principle that it is really important to release material, but you're only going to release it to nice people. You're not going to let terrorists and dictators peruse it and use it. But that's what they do, and that's what they are doing, because Mr. Snowden decided to let them do that. Also, it is important, I think, that what Mr. Snowden did must be viewed in the context of an overall approach toward dealing with these tremendous issues of privacy versus security. He looked at this question, apparently, from the point of view of one who can pick and choose those portions of an obligation that he wants to maintain. He did not stay with the proposition that he had to fulfill his obligation to the United States across the board. He ignored some duties and did not ignore others, but he did not fulfill his obligations overall. What are the consequences of this? Well, I'm going to mention 5 cases that have come to light from Snowden materials and printed in the blogs about what the consequences are of dealing with international relations in this way and forcing your country to do it by the leaks that you have sponsored or undertaken. For example, China is the bad boy of cyber attacks. Throughout the world, Chinese cyber attacks, theft of information and material, malware, on and on, are a nuisance at best and a potential tragedy at worst to a huge range of countries and individuals. We had figured out a way, pre-Snowden, the United States government had, to essentially have a bit of a jujitsu operation against the Chinese and to create a possibility whereby we could take their malware in a cyber world and send it back to them after making some adjustments and create problems for them rather than they creating problems for us. It's a clever operation. Mr. Snowden, of course, ended it by explicitly turning loose material that dealt with it precisely. We have an organization in the Middle East, the Islamic State of Iraq, a terrorist organization of the worst kind, Pre-Snowden, we were reading not only their emails, but their preparation, their early stage drafts of emails. Had we been reading fully the emails of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, we might well have saved thousands of lives. But here, our ability to read ISI's emails has been now obliterated by having been made public to the terrorist group itself. The Defense Department working together with the intelligence community, it has come to be possible to utilize cell phones and their operation with some very clever software in such a way that you can help an individual member of the military or an individual CIA operations officer know whether he or she is being followed or not. A very clever system, one that saves people's lives. That also is no longer with us because Snowden betrayed it, and it's now known to our adversaries. In Latin America, we have come to find how to penetrate the communication networks of some of the worst organizations and groups that are selling women, principally women, into sexual slavery. We had a very good handle on how that was being done, working with other Latin American countries in dealing with it, and that trafficking, that human trafficking network, and our knowledge of their capabilities is, of course, now gone, with Snowden having released that to those who are enslaving women in that part of the world.
The next defense witness will be Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. Dr. Ellsberg precipitated a national political controversy in 1971 when he released the top-secret Pentagon Papers, which revealed that the government had knowledge early on that the Vietnam War could most likely not be won, and that continuing it would lead to many times more casualties than was ever admitted publicly. Further, as an editor of the New York Times was to write much later, these documents, quote, demonstrated, among other things, that the Johnson administration had systematically lied not only to the public, but to Congress about a subject of transcendent national interest and significance, close quote. Dr. Ellsberg, would you testify that Edward Snowden was justified in revealing the information he did about the NSA's activities?
Yes, I believe that Edward Snowden was fully justified in what he did. That does not cause me to support or make a judgment on any particular thing which has not yet been released or which has been released exactly, but a question of whether he has served the public interest on balance in a way that could not have happened otherwise. I think that he was justified to the same degree and in the same way that I believe I was justified in releasing 4,000 or 7,000 pages of top-secret documents 40 years ago, the Pentagon Papers. I believe that I had been mistaken earlier to keep silent about what I knew to be lies by my president, Lyndon Johnson, and later the President Richard Nixon, for whom I'd also worked, about what they were doing, what was happening, what the costs were, what the prospects were in Vietnam. I was concerned at that moment, not so much about the Constitution, which had clearly been violated in terms of lying us into that war, but I was concerned at the people who were dying on both sides, wrongly, I thought, by our escalations and by those lies. I'm saying that Snowden, I believe, did what needed to be done, what the public needed to know. I think there was no other way, no better way, and almost no other way for that information to get out, that it was worth, as he said, taking the utmost risks to his freedom and even his life. And of course, we've heard exhortations actually by Mike Rogers of the House Intelligence Committee, or the Homeland Security Committee,
that he should be extra-legally assassinated. Others have suggested by due process of law. I give Ambassador Woolsey credit for talking about the need for due process here. But the fact is, had I believed the motives that were described by the people, at the beginning of the supposed opposition to Snowden, and we haven't heard that precisely from these two people yet, or at all. But if I believed that he had done this for some other country, for Russia, for China, to their benefit, or even to major benefit to them, outweighing any benefit to the public interest, I would not be supporting him now. I believe firmly that Edward Snowden is no more a traitor than I am, or that I was, and I'm not. I was called that by the president and the vice president at the time, 40 years ago, 43 years ago. I was called every name that has been called virtually to Edward Snowden, or for that matter to Chelsea Manning earlier. In terms of blood on hands as to what would be the cost of this, none of that came out in my case, which is, I think, why I'm seen somewhat differently now, 40 years later. Nothing in Chelsea Manning's trial actually came out to justify the statement that people had died as a result of his revelations. And I think you should take with more than a grain of salt the descriptions right now that much worse will happen from Edward Snowden revelations. The fact is that I think what he revealed was not just what NSA was doing, which I'll premise, I will stipulate, was essentially with the knowledge of the president, at the orders of the president, desire of the president, and the knowledge of key figures in Congress. But as Ben Weisner made the point, that to me reveals his greatest revelation, which is that the reforms that came in after earlier revelations of abuses by the FBI, CIA, NSA, and Army intelligence 40 years ago and 35 years ago that led to the Church Committee and the current reforms like the FISA court and the intelligence committees, I think what Snowden has revealed is that those reforms, which were very necessary, failed. And they need to be not only redone, but better reforms are necessary, and I hope very much will result from what Snowden has revealed.
The last witness for the prosecution will be Edward McCarthy. In 1992, he served as the government prosecutor who convicted the Blind Sheik of masterminding the first attack on the World Trade Center. He is also a writer for the National Review. Mr. McCarthy, about 10 years ago, you debated another issue related to national security and surveillance. Would you be kind enough to review the comments you made at that time?
The question was whether we needed to have more surveillance to prevent terrorist attacks. And it was interesting. The audience was of a mind that, we absolutely did need more surveillance. They recognized we had serious enemies of the United States who wanted to mass murder Americans. But something made them uncomfortable. And when we got to talk to them afterwards, I got to find out what the something was. George Bush. Not George Bush the person, but the concept that so much power was reposed in one individual. That one person could be able to order warrantless surveillance, that one person could get to be the judge, the jury, in some instances as commander-in-chief, the executioner, on the basis of the information that was gleaned from the warrantless surveillance that was ordered, surveillance that took place without the permission of a court. And that was what the audience back then had the most trouble with, this idea that we don't have enough checks and balances. We don't have enough legislative buy-in. We don't have enough judicial oversight. It's interesting because what President Bush was trying to impose on this sort of new kind of war was old rules of war.
Attorney McCarthy, was there anything that Edward Snowden revealed that needed to be revealed? For example, that the phone calls and emails of millions of Americans were being monitored by the government without a warrant, and that the NSA was listening into dozens of world leaders, including our allies?
We've spent about a half century now experimenting, and I think the experiment is still ongoing, with how far we can afford to depart from the vision of the framers. And from the 1970s forward, What we have tried to do is take rule of law protocols which apply to the United States and mainly the law enforcement system in peacetime and impose them on war. And we've had a very difficult time doing it. It's been a blistering debate at times, and nobody's happy about it. Nobody's ever happy about what the outcome is. Some people think the executive doesn't have enough control anymore. Some think the courts are too involved. Some think the courts are not involved enough. But here's the interesting thing. We did get to a place where we came together as a country, and even if everybody was not satisfied with the outcome, we did strike a balance. We established laws which took away a lot of the president's unilateral power, forced the president to go to judges in order to get surveillance authority, institutionalized rigorous congressional oversight. In fact, most of what we know about abuses at the NSA actually comes from self-reporting, whether it's self-reporting to courts or self-reporting to Congress. You may not like the laws. I don't like the laws the way that they've finally played out. The NSA program, the metadata program, is a perfect example. There's no question that it's constitutional. There's Supreme Court precedent that holds that. Whether it's legal or not under the statute that Congress imposed is a closer question. It turns on what the legal definition of relevance as applied to this national security question is. Is it legal? Is it not legal? You can make the argument that it's not, but 15 federal judges who've looked at it have upheld it. And nobody has repealed it yet for all the talk about doing that. But here's the thing. We actually set up this system with exactly the checks and balances that were at issue during the Bush days. The bad old Bush days when too much power was reposed in one person. And now where are we with Edward Snowden? We're right back to one person who's judge, jury, lawgiver, one person who decides what American secrets get kept and what gets exposed to our enemies. And that person's not the president anymore. That person is a person who had access to this information because he violated his oath. The last time I was here, the audience told me that could never, ever be justified.
Mr. Wisner, didn't Congress already know that metadata was being collected? Didn't the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Court approve of its being collected?
Well, I've been following this issue very closely, to say the least, over the last 10 years or more. I did not know until The Guardian published the document that the NSA, which is a foreign intelligence agency, was on a daily basis collecting the phone records of almost every American. Someone else who didn't know, or says he didn't know, is Republican Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, who is one of the principal authors of the Patriot Act, who says that he didn't know until this document was published that Section 215 of the Patriot Act was being used in this way. Whether, again, that's true or not isn't important to my argument. Either he did not know, he certainly should have known. Either way, Congress didn't do anything about it. As soon as the public was read into this debate, we're now seeing open federal courts debate the constitutionality of this. One federal judge actually enjoined it and said it's almost certainly unconstitutional. And we're seeing Congress threaten not to reauthorize this.
Mr. Woolsey, Mr. Snowden has revealed that the NSA has been collecting metadata about Americans' phone calls. The term meta, as you know, means about. Metadata means about data, or about phone calls in this case. Could you comment on this?
Much of the controversy here involves metadata, which lets the executive branch, and has for many years, lets them see and keep a record of what is on the outside of an envelope, let's say in first-class mail, the address, the return address, and the postmark. That's been approved by the courts for a long time. It has been true for decades. It's true now. That is basically metadata with first-class mail. If you do it with telephone calls, Call, number that was called from, length of call. What has changed here is not that the federal government has gone away from a reasonable policy. It was, and I think it still is. What's changed is Moore's Law. What's changed is now we are talking about emails and telephone calls in the gazillions rather than first-class letters. But you still do not hear of substantial malfeasance or other steps using simply the metadata.
So, James Woolsey, you're saying there really was no, the alarm did not need to be rung. There wasn't a fire in that sense.
Where alarms need to be rung, they should be discussed, and sometimes it's important. I stood behind at the time, and I stand behind Daniel Ellsberg now, for his courage in moving on the Pentagon Papers. He was dealing with policy issues and major lies that had come at us from the executive branch, and he did a courageous job, defended himself in court. Federal government misbehaved, and he was released. But what Daniel Ellsberg did, I think, deserved a whistleblowing. What happens when metadata goes as a result of the development of electronics from one instrumentality to another doesn't change the fact that metadata is just metadata.
Mr. Wisner, didn't Congress already know that metadata was being collected? Didn't the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Court approve of its being collected?
The court that had approved this 15 times had exceeded its mandate. This is a court that quite properly was set up to hear warrant applications in secret. When you're seeking a warrant, you don't need an adversarial process. We don't want the person who we're conducting surveillance on to know that we've sought a warrant. What this court started to do over the last decade was to write long opinions, 30, 50, 80 pages long, ruling on whether whole programs of surveillance were consistent with federal statutes and consistent with the Constitution. They did that without the benefit of any adversary. They did that without anybody arguing the other side in front of these courts. Many of these judges who have left the court have said they would have benefited from an adversary. And what's happened now that these same challenges are being brought in open federal courts? Well, now there's a 50-50 response so far. One judge in New York said that he thought that the phone records program was legal. One judge in D.C., a Republican judge appointed by a Republican president, said he thought the program was almost Orwellian and a threat to democracy.
Okay. Mr. Ellsberg, couldn't Mr. Snowden have reported what he believed to be unconstitutional activities at the NSA to his superiors? Did he have to resort to the press to have these activities reassessed?
There were 4 NSA high officials, senior officials. I'll name them: Kurt Wiebe, Ed Loomis, Bill Binney, and Thomas Drake, who have among them an average of 30 years in the NSA. One is 28, another is 32, who left the NSA because it conflicted with their conscience. Eventually, they left it because it conflicted with the Constitution. They had tested the proposition that there are other ways to do it in every possible way. They had complained to their superiors that the then warrantless surveillance that was going on since 9/11 was unconstitutional, was a violation of the Fourth Amendment.
What was the constitutional violation?
The Fourth Amendment.
Oh, really?
Well,
but Andrew, let him just finish.
Yeah,
I want to stay on the point of whether he had another way.
Let me say on that. Let me go a little further. It wasn't just unconstitutional. The warrantless surveillance, I think, was blatantly illegal and criminal. Actually,
but
from
Daniel,
2000. I'm sorry, I do need to say.
Wait, just a minute. I just want you to complete your thought on why he had no other way, and I want to hear from your opponents what the other way was.
They did everything. They went to their superiors. They went to the Inspector Generals of NSA and of the DIB. They went to congressional staff and asked to testify. They asked to testify in open court under oath. They got nowhere. Every one of them was subject wrongly to an FBI raid which took their computers without charging them ever with anything. Thomas Drake has got a spurious investigation and so forth. They have each said, in contrast, without endorsing everything that Snowden has said, they have said the path he used was the only way to do what they had tried to do, was to bring this to the attention of Congress and the public, and that there was no other way to do it.
Mr. McCarthy, you have heard what Daniel Ellsberg just said. All attempts to make such information known by reporting it to superiors appears to have failed when others used them. What else could Mr. Snowden have done to make his concerns known?
He could have gone to inspectors general in his own agency. I haven't heard any evidence that he actually tried to take any of these steps whatsoever.
Did he try,
Yeah,
Ben Weisner?
he did. He certainly has told Barton Gellman of the Washington Post that he did complain regularly internally, but it's interesting that you think he should have gone to the same Congress that you say knew everything that he was going to report. Congress did know. He was supposed to tell Senator Wyden was on the floor of the Senate with his hair on fire saying, if only the public knew what I knew, they would be outraged, they would be furious. Well, we didn't know because he didn't tell us. We only know it because Edward Snowden gave it to the press, and the press told us. Now the rules are changing.
But when you say he did try, really, how hard did he try to go up the chain of command?
Well, and how effective could it have been?
No, it's a different question.
No,
you're saying he didn't try because you're saying he didn't try because he didn't think it would work.
No, I'm saying he did report his concerns to superiors. One time when he reported concerns to superiors in a posting in Geneva, he was reprimanded and punished for it. This is the experience of people who complain in the intelligence community, is that they either get ignored or they get crushed.
I think that's nonsense. I have had an inspector general look into my management of the intelligence community and have disputes about it with him. I have seen a whole range of approaches of people inside intelligence organizations go up the chain through the processes that let them argue that they've not been well treated. These systems are not fanciful. They work most of the time. They're not perfect. But generally speaking, if you have an inspector general or you have a committee of the Congress that has responsibilities, you live in a free country. You can go see people. You can make appointments. You can argue. You can compromise. It's the way we do things. But you can't just forever add people and offices. Otherwise, you won't have anybody doing anything else. You already have so many people and so many structures preserving oversight over the intelligence community that the mind reels.
Daniel Ellsberg.
I can believe that Ambassador Woolsey is totally sincere in his description of that. Of course, he's not speaking as a whistleblower, and I wonder how many whistleblowers actual whistleblowers he has actually spoken to. I have a great many, the Government Accountability Project and many others. The experience of going to IGs is simply a way of being, and to your superiors, is a way of identifying yourself as a troublemaker who will be suspected of being a leaker. If there is a leak, that's why the 4 NSA people who had not been a leak to the New York Times, which in my opinion, they should have been, and certainly would have been more effective. That's why they were raided by the FBI and the computers, because they identified themselves as somebody who already thought the system was unconstitutional. And I want to make one last point here. Russell Tice, well, first Thomas Drake has said, the one I'm talking about has said, the secret they're trying to hold on to desperately is to talk about metadata and not reveal how much content they are already recording. And Russell Tice has said, I, in the NSA, had phone records of Judge Alito, of journalist sources, of Congress people, including Feinstein and her staff, and a great deal of content. Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's wrong. But he has asked to testify under oath to Congress, and not one committee has asked one of them to testify because they don't want to know.
Mr. Weisner, was it necessary for Mr. Snowden to reveal the amount of information that he did in order to start the process he was seeking?
The number of documents that Snowden has disclosed is 0. Snowden provided a great deal of material to journalists. He entrusted it to journalists at The Guardian, at The Washington Post. It's since expanded to The New York Times and other newspapers. His instructions to those reporters were that they, in consultation with their own editors, using their own judgment of what was in the public interest, and in consultation with the United States government, should publish what the public ought to know and should withhold what the public should not know. My view is that the reporting until now has been extremely responsible. There has not been an article published that didn't give at least the government a chance to weigh in. There have been redactions.
But then why should critics of Snowden feel better about that? Why should that make them feel
Well, I mean, this is
disclosing to Greenwald disclosing? Are you saying that disclosing to Greenwald is not disclosing?
No. What I'm saying is there is a difference and a long tradition of having journalists compete with the security state over what should be secret and what should be public. If you look at the last decade, what we would not have known without leaks and investigative journalists, we wouldn't have known about torture at Abu Ghraib, we wouldn't have known that the CIA had set up a network of secret prisons across Europe and the Middle East, we wouldn't have known that the NSA had engaged in warrantless wiretapping before this was legalized by Congress in 2008. All of this we know because journalists engage in competition with government for what the public ought to know and what it shouldn't know. Now, what Snowden did was on a larger scale. He gave a large amount of information to journalists, and those journalists include journalists around the world. I think part of what he wanted us to understand is that this is not about demonizing the NSA. The threat of mass dragnet surveillance, of collecting information about all of us in case one of us comes under suspicion, is a threat to all free societies.
Sir, was your question, couldn't he have done the same thing with fewer documents? Yes. Okay, could he have not done the same thing with fewer documents?
We don't know the answer yet. We don't know what has still to be published. It's possible that the most important revelation that Snowden provided to journalists has not yet been published. Do I think that the reporting so far has been in the public interest? I think so, profoundly.
Jim Woolsey, do you want to respond to that?
Yes. Snowden has released in some fashion, maybe he doesn't consider giving to newspaper reporters and letting them hold on to it while they release, but nonetheless, he's released, according to the press, 1.7 million.
According to national security officials, not according to the press. The press quoting unnamed national security officials, quoting classified reports. That information is as false as their testimony was to Congress.
We can track back through that if you want, but I think the key issue is what has he provided to the outside world that gets, at the end of this chain of press to non-press to whatever, gets put in places where people can publicly read it. I gave you 4 examples of 4 major American programs that were extremely useful. And the blog material indicates that this is material that was disclosed as a result of Snowden's efforts and operations. And we lost all 4 of those programs, and we will lose a lot more.
So does that concern this side? Daniel Ellsberg.
I'm sorry. The statement that NSA has lost those programs is as reliable as the statement by NSA that he's released 1.7 million documents. Snowden has said publicly, and to me, it so happens on encryption line, that that's an absurd estimate and has no relation to the much, much, much lower amount that he released in terms of this. And the reason that does make a difference is that obviously 1.7 or 1 million or half a million can't be read by him. He learned from Manning to avoid the charge that he was releasing anything he had not read himself.
Daniel, why do you say, I think the word was absurd, the statement you said Jim Woolsey made, that 4 important programs have been lost. Why is that an absurd statement?
No, it's not absurd. Maybe it happened. But to take at face value the statement that NSA has not been able to replace that it doesn't have substitutes, that it actually caused them harm.
Some of those programs are not NSA programs, they're military programs.
Fine.
Some of the programs
that's part of it.
The programs of other foreign intelligence services.
What I'm saying is that this sort of thing can't be decided by you or me or by the press. It has to be decided by intelligence committees in a court that have an entirely different technical capability and backup and technical access to NSA programs that does not exist now. And I've been trying to give one specific example of that. When Russell Tice has said numerous times in public that he had evidence, personal knowledge, first of targeting of every member of the Armed Service Committee, every member of the Intelligence Committee, including Feinstein, her staff and home. He prepared to testify that under oath. When he said that he wanted to testify, NSA immediately sent him a letter, which I've seen, saying, this is to the Armed Services Committee, your old committee. And he said, I want to testify to Armed Services. And they said, we remind you of your oath under NSA. The Armed Services Committee, and they didn't distinguish between staff and members, the Armed Services Committee is not cleared for that information. What? This is oversight? This is an absolutely broken system.
When you give up secrets, you say that the public needs to know. Well, you can't inform the public about the methods and sources of the intelligence community without informing people who want to mass murder Americans. You can't inform the public about the methods and sources not only of your own intelligence service, but of the foreign intelligence services that we depend on the cooperation of to keep Americans safe, without convincing those foreign services that we are no longer trustworthy repositories of their secrets. When I was here last time, I keep going back to it because it's such a strange variance, but when I was here the last time, one of the things that people were very concerned about is that we had isolated ourselves by making unilateral executive branch decisions that not only the other branches of the government didn't support, but that had made us look bad in the international community, and that if we were going to have effective counterterrorism, we needed the cooperation of our allies, because there were many, many places in the world where they had good sources and we didn't, and we couldn't protect the country without that. When you reveal not only our secrets but their secrets, and you convince them that they might as well not tell us anything because we can't keep a secret, then we lose that cooperation. And that means that we lose our sources of information in the places of the world that are most dangerous to us.
Mr. Wisner, if, as the prosecution has argued, the revelations made by Mr. Snowden caused damage to United States security, do you still think it was justified to have made those revelations?
Yes, I think so. I think, look, it's interesting that we have a strict liability standard for disclosing information, but we have a classification system that massively overclassifies. Both can be dangers. Look, I think that what Edward Snowden did is go about it in a way that he considered responsible. He said, I've spent a sheltered life. I've been in the intelligence community. I don't trust my own biases. I'm going to go to principled but aggressive journalists. And those journalists should use their judgment about what should be published. Now, Edward Snowden told Time magazine he didn't agree with all those judgments, that there were articles that were published that he did not agree were in the public interest, but that proved his point that he is not the one who should have been making those decisions alone and on his own. But look, I think it's relevant to the question. If you could show me with evidence and not classified innuendo that what Edward Snowden did was more damaging to our national security than healthy for our democracy, I would take a different position. Nothing I've heard pushes me there.
Are you saying, though, that then he's not in control of what he took?
I'm saying he's not in control of what's being published.
So he takes it, he gives it to others, and then he's done.
Well, that's actually what most leakers do.
I'm sorry, a point here has been, that Ben, I'm surprised didn't make. It's not just that he gave it to journalists for their judgment. It's been passed over very quickly here. The Guardian and the Washington Post have both said that they have checked every article that they put out with NSA. Some would disagree with their doing that, but they have done it precisely to avoid danger of the sources and methods that you're describing of causing definite harm.
Mr. McCarthy, we are reaching the end of this trial. So far, the presentations have focused on differences in judgment and opinion between the two sides. As we close the trial, let me ask you, do you believe there is some common position on which both sides might agree?
How do you impose the rule of law on the demands of war? Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we don't get it right. But the point is, we're now at least at a place where civil liberties actually are elevated in a way that they never were before.